Okay, so imagine you're faced with a choice. Not like a huge world-changing thing, but something small, maybe helping a friend move. And you see this painting they love, but, well, it's truly awful. Do you tell them? Maybe hurt their feelings? Or just, praise it, keep them happy? Or maybe donating money? Do you give locally something that feels close? Or like to a big global thing that says it does way more good per dollar, suddenly doing the most good. It's not so simple, is it? Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into the science of human utilitarianism. And this isn't just some dusty philosophical idea you vaguely remember from a textbook. No, this is a really profound, often unconscious force that shapes, well, everything. From those little dilemmas we just mentioned, all the way up to global policy, how our societies are set up, even how we're designing AI.
That's exactly right. And our mission here in this deep dive is to really unpack how this deep-seated human drive, this urge to maximize well-being or happiness, or maybe just getting what we prefer, how that shapes us, our behavior, our culture, our history, often without us even realizing it. We're going to try and connect the dots across, well, a whole bunch of disciplines. You'll find some genuinely surprising things, I think, and hopefully get a kind of shortcut to understanding yourself and the world a bit better.
Yeah, and to do that, we've pulled together insights from, let's see, evolutionary biology, neuroscience, psychology, computational science, and of course, philosophy. So get ready to maybe rethink what it even means to make a good decision. Okay, let's start with the basics, the philosophical bedrock. When we talk utilitarianism, we're talking consequentialism, right? Most people have heard that phrase, the ends justify the means. But it gets complicated fast, doesn't it? Especially when you compare it to other ways of thinking, like focusing on rules or on character. How does that outcomes first thing really work if, say, the motive was bad?
You've hit the nail on the head there. That's the core idea. For a utilitarian, the moral value of an action, it's judged only by its consequences, its outcomes. Whether the intention was good or bad, whether you broke a rule, that's secondary. If the action leads to the best possible result overall, then it's the right action. This is the heart of the greatest happiness principle. Actions are right if they promote happiness or pleasure, wrong if they cause pain or suffering. And what was truly revolutionary, kind of radical when it first came about, was its impartiality. It's universalist. It wasn't just your happiness or my happiness or our little groups. Everyone's counts equally. And here's the kicker. Happiness or pleasure, that's seen as the only thing with intrinsic value. Good in itself. Everything else, money, health, freedom, it only has instrumental value. Its worth comes from whether it helps produce that happiness.
Okay, so this focus on maximizing good, it wasn't entirely new with the famous utilitarians. It has older roots.
Oh, absolutely. You see forms of hedonism way back in ancient Greece. Thinkers like Aristippus, championing pleasure, maybe more basic pleasure, and Epicurus, who refined it towards simpler, more sustainable pleasures, friendship, peace of mind, that sort of thing. But maybe even more striking, in ancient China, you had the philosopher Mozi. He developed this kind of state consequentialism, arguing that government policy should aim to maximize benefit and minimize harm for everyone, that impartial concern we just talked about, centuries before the British utilitarians.
Fascinating. But the names we really associate with it are Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Bentham, he was the one who really tried to turn ethics into a science, wasn't he?
He was, yeah. A really interesting figure, almost like an engineer trying to build a system for morality. He famously said, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure." And he genuinely thought you could quantify it. He proposed this philosophic calculus, or hedonic calculus. It was this theoretical method to basically add up all the pleasure and subtract all the pain caused by an action across everyone affected. He even listed dimensions, intensity, duration, certainty, how soon it would happen, and so on. It was a huge, maybe even audacious attempt to make morality empirical, objective.
Wow, like a mathematical formula for good. And then Mill, his godson, he came along and kind of humanized it, add something more.
Yeah. Mill respected Bentham's approach, but saw its, let's say, crudeness. He brought in a crucial qualitative dimension. He argued pretty persuasively that not all pleasures are equal. There are lower pleasures, think bodily sensations, basic urges, and then there are higher pleasures engaging our intellect, our feelings, imagination, our moral sentiments, things uniquely human. His famous line sums it up perfectly. "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied."
Right, I remember that quote.
And he suggested a test, the competent judge's test. Only people who've experienced both kinds of pleasure are qualified to say which is better. And it just feels right, doesn't it? Our
Yeah.
intuition tells us that reading a great book isn't quite the same kind of good as eating a tasty meal, even if both are pleasant.
That definitely feels more relatable than just adding up pleasure points. And the thinking kept evolving, right?
Yeah.
People like Peter Singer moved towards preference, utilitarianism.
Exactly. Singer and others felt that just focusing on pleasure and pain might be too narrow. What about achieving your goals? Or living by your values? So preference utilitarianism defines utility as satisfying preferences or interests. It's broader, allows for more complexity in what constitutes a good life. And this whole journey from Bentham's sort of mechanistic view to Mill's quality distinction to preferences, it's not just philosophy changing. It kind of mirrors how our scientific understanding of psychology has evolved too, from simple models to more nuanced ones. The science of utilitarianism adapts.
Okay, so we've got the foundation. But even within this idea, there's this big split, this tension act versus rule utilitarianism. How does that work?
Yeah, this is a really important distinction for actually trying to apply utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism, or AU, looks at each individual action one by one. You're in the specific situation and you ask, which action right here, right now, will produce the absolute best outcome, the most utility? Its strength is flexibility, but the big criticism is that it could, theoretically, justify things we usually think are wrong, like lying or breaking a promise, maybe even sacrificing an innocent person in some extreme thought experiment if it produced the best consequences in that one instance.
Okay, so very focused on the specific moment.
Yeah.
And rule utilitarianism pulls back.
Exactly. Rule utilitarianism, or RU, asks a different question, not what about this action, but what about the rule? It asks, what are the consequences if everyone adopted a general rule to act this way in this type of situation? So the right action is the one that follows a rule that, if generally followed, would lead to the greatest overall good in the long run. Think about the doctor example. Maybe lying to a terminally ill patient spares them pain right now. An act utilitarian might consider that. But a ruled utilitarian would say, wait, what if the rule was doctors should generally lie to patients? That would destroy trust in the whole medical system, right? So the rule doctors should be honest likely produces more good overall, even if it's hard in specific cases.
That makes a lot of sense for building a stable society with trust. So how do we square these two? Is it always one or the other?
Well, that leads to this idea of two-level utilitarianism, which R.M. Hare talked about. It's kind of a hybrid approach. It suggests that most of the time in daily life, we operate on an intuitive level. We use simple, general moral rules like don't lie, keep promises as mental shortcuts. It's efficient. We don't calculate everything from scratch. But when we face really complex dilemmas or when our usual rules conflict, we need to shift gears. We move up to a critical level. And here we do engage in that more careful, reflective, act utilitarian thinking, weighing the specific consequences of our options in that tricky situation. It tries to balance efficiency and stability with nuanced judgment.
This feels like a perfect bridge because this internal tug-of-war, this drive, it's not just philosophy. It seems like it's wired right into our biology, into our brains. How does evolution come into play here?
Yeah. Oh, it's fascinating how deep it goes. Charles Darwin himself, in The Descent of Man, he argued our moral sense evolved. Things like sympathy, cooperation, helping others. These social instincts gave groups a survival advantage. He thought that as our intelligence grew, the greatest happiness principle would just naturally become the standard for judging right and wrong.
But then there's this challenging idea, evolutionary debunking. It kind of throws a spanner in the works, doesn't it?
It does. It asks a really deep question. If our basic feelings, like pleasure being good, pain being bad, are just evolutionary adaptations that helped our ancestors survive and reproduce, does that mean they aren't objectively true? Does it undermine utilitarianism's claim to objectivity? It challenges the very foundation.
That's a heavy thought. Is there a counter to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Philosophers like Peter Singer push back. They argue that, okay, maybe our parochial instincts favoring our family, our tribe, are evolved. That makes sense. But they argue the universalist principle of utilitarianism, this impartial concern for everyone's well-being, regardless of group that's different, that, they contend, comes from our capacity for abstract reason. It's a higher-level cognitive function that lets us transcend those built-in biases. So you have this fundamental clash, our evolved tribal gut feelings versus reasoned impartial ethics.
Okay, so if lower pleasures, food, sex, basic survival stuff, are the direct evolutionary wiring, where do Mill's higher pleasures, art, philosophy, complex thought, fit in?
This evolutionary view actually gives a pretty strong scientific footing to Mill's distinction, which is quite neat, the lower pleasures. Yeah, those are exactly what natural selection would directly favor immediate rewards for doing things essential for survival and reproduction. They're hardwired. But the higher pleasures, they seem to be more like emergent properties of our incredibly complex brains. Our huge cognitive capacity allows for these experiences that weren't directly selected for in the same way. So pursuing them is almost like engaging a part of us that's achieved some freedom from pure biological imperative. It's exercising our rational reflective side over just instinct.
Wow. And this fight between instinct and reason, it's not just theoretical. You can actually see it happening in the brain.
You absolutely can. Joshua Green's work, the dual process model, is really illuminating here. He basically showed that moral judgments often involve a kind of competition between two different brain systems.
Okay, tell us about these two systems.
So first, you've got the fast automatic emotional system. This involves older brain areas like the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the amygdala regions tied to emotion, gut feelings, social responses. It spits out quick, intuitive judgments, often aligned with basic rules like don't harm others directly. Think of it as the brain's shortcut, low-effort system. Then there's the slow, deliberate cognitive system. This engages parts like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which handles abstract reasoning, planning, cognitive control. This system does the conscious, effortful work of weighing costs and benefits, calculating outcomes, which is, very utilitarian in its style.
So the famous trolley problem, that's not just a philosophical puzzle, it's like watching these two brain systems duke it out.
Exactly. In the switch dilemma, flip a switch. Trolley kills one person instead of 5. Most people say, yeah, okay. That tends to engage the cognitive calculating system, more utilitarian. But the footbridge dilemma, you have to physically push a large person off a bridge to stop the trolley and save 5. Most people react with horror. No way, boom. That direct personal harm triggers a strong alarm in the emotional system, which often overrides the cold calculation. That feeling of being torn, the discomfort, that's literally the conflict between these two neural networks playing out. It's a window into why morality feels so, complicated sometimes. We're built for this internal struggle.
So our gut feelings, those deontological don't do that rules, often come from these older, evolved emotional responses. While utilitarianism relies on our more recently evolved, effortful reasoning capacity, this isn't fixed at birth. It develops over time.
Absolutely. The work of Piaget, and especially Lawrence Kohlberg, maps out this developmental journey really well. Piaget saw kids moving from a stage where rules are absolute and consequences are everything, heteronomous morality, to understanding rules as social agreements where intentions matter more, autonomous morality.
And Kohlberg took that further with his stages, focusing on the reasons people give for their moral choices.
Yes. His 3 levels are key. First, pre-conventional morality. This is basically driven by self-interest, egoistic utility. Stage 1, avoid punishment. Stage 2, what's in it for me? It's a very primitive utility calculation focused entirely on self. Then comes conventional morality. Here, morality is about fitting in, maintaining social relationships. Stage 3, seeking approval, being good. Stage 4, upholding laws, maintaining social order because it's the rule. This is about internalizing society's rules, which are often implicitly utilitarian for the group. Finally, post-conventional morality. This is where people start thinking about abstract principles. Stage 5, understanding laws as a social contract for the greater good, but also recognizing universal values. Stage 6, acting based on self-chosen, universal ethical principles like justice and dignity, even if they conflict with the law. This is the capacity for that critical utilitarian or rights-based thinking we talked about.
Okay, so putting it all together, evolution, neuroscience, development, it paints this picture of moral decision-making as this really complex, multi-layered system, often conflicted, yes, but also with this amazing potential for growth. A mature moral person uses both the quick rules and the slower, deliberate reasoning. All right, let's shift gears now and see how this plays out in the real world from, say, family life right up to global society.
Yeah, the utilitarian calculus, or maybe the struggle with it, starts at the micro level. Individual choices, small groups, and the family is probably the most fundamental place we see it.
So you mentioned earlier, what's the best way to raise a good child? From a utilitarian viewpoint, what does that actually mean?
Well, you're kind of optimizing, aren't you? The goal is to raise an adult who can achieve personal well-being and contribute positively to the well-being of others. A good child develops what we call prosocial tendencies, empathy, cooperation, and decades of developmental psychology research points pretty consistently to one style: authoritative parenting.
Authoritative, what does that involve?
It's got 2 key parts: high demandingness and high responsiveness. High demandingness means setting clear rules, having expectations, following through with consequences. structure. But, and this is crucial, it's balanced with high responsiveness. That means warmth, affection, listening to the child, and critically, explaining the reasons behind the rules, engaging in that dialogue. I mean, trying to explain why to a toddler can test your patience, but that why is doing important work.
And that explanation, the why, fosters moral reasoning, not just rule following.
Exactly. By explaining the reasons, parents help kids move beyond just avoiding punishment. They start to understand rules as part of a cooperative system for everyone's benefit. It builds internal motivation. And by modeling warmth and listening, parents teach empathy. It's actually a really practical, almost instinctive application of rule utilitarianism within the family. The focus isn't just immediate obedience, but building a system of understanding that leads to the best long-term outcome. A well-adjusted, empathetic person who can think morally. The family is the first training ground.
So from the family, we move out into society. And that's where things like game theory become useful for understanding how our choices interact. Right? The prisoner's dilemma is the classic example.
It's the perfect, stark illustration of that tension between individual gain and collective good. You know the setup. Two suspects, questioned separately. If both keep quiet, cooperate, they both get a short sentence. If one rats out the other, defects, while the other stays quiet, the defector walks free, the quiet one gets hammered. If both defect, they both get a medium sentence. Now, from a purely rational, self-interested point of view, defecting is always the best individual strategy, no matter what the other person does. But if both follow that rational logic, they both end up worse off than if they'd cooperated.
It shows how individual rationality can lead straight to a collectively bad outcome. How do we solve these kinds of traps in real life?
Well, think about an even simpler game, like driving. Two cars meet on a road, swerve left or right. Without a rule, it's chaos. There's no rational way to coordinate the solution. A simple, pre-agreed, socially enforced rule. Drive on the right or left, depending where you are. That rule transforms the situation. And what's really interesting is that a huge amount of our culture, our laws, our social norms, they're essentially these kinds of rules. They're rule utilitarian solutions to recurring problems of cooperation, evolved over time to maximize the group's long-term benefit.
Okay, but if rules are so beneficial, why do human groups so often seem to, well, disregard the rules when it comes to other groups? Why try to undermine or even get rid of other cultures? This feels like where the rational ideal really breaks down.
This hits on that deep paradox again, our evolved parochial psychology. Our default setting for the utility calculus isn't universal, it's tribal. Think about our evolutionary history. Small, kin-based groups competing for scarce resources. In that environment, strong in-group cooperation combined with suspicion and hostility towards outgroups was highly adaptive. It helped your group survive. This likely ingrained tendencies like xenophobia, maybe even specific adaptations for intergroup conflict, like the male warrior hypothesis some researchers talk about.
So this us versus them thinking is really baked in deep.
It seems to be. Social identity theory helps explain the psychological mechanism. First, we automatically categorize, social categorization, us and them. Then we link our own self-worth to our group's success, social identification. Finally, we engage in biased comparisons to make our group look better. Social comparison, seeking positive distinctiveness. And the inevitable result is in-group favoritism, we treat us better. And out-group derogation, we view them more negatively, sometimes much more negatively.
And cognitive biases make it worse.
Definitely. We tend to feel less empathy for outgroup members. We see them as more alike than they really are, the outgroup homogeneity bias. And in extreme cases, this can slide into dehumanization, which historically has been a terrifying enabler of violence and atrocities. So here's the profound, uncomfortable paradox. This tribalism is a kind of utilitarianism. It's just a very limited parochial version, maximize utility for the in-group, even if it harms the out-group. It clashes directly with the impartial ideal of classical utilitarianism, and this clash, this tension between our tribal wiring and our capacity for broader reason, is arguably the biggest source of conflict and injustice throughout human history. The whole project of civilization, in a way, is trying to expand that circle of who counts as us.
That's a really powerful way to frame it. So, scaling up again, how does this connect to the structures of government and law?
Well, you can see the modern state, with all its laws and policies, as this massive ongoing attempt to apply utility principles on a large scale. Though it's always imperfect, right? From a utilitarian view, the government's authority, the legitimacy of laws, it doesn't come from divine right or tradition alone. It comes from their utility, the fact that they generally produce more well-being, more order, more benefit than chaos would. Even individual rights in this framework aren't absolute natural things. They're incredibly important social constructs, justified because protecting them generally leads to a happier, more functional society overall.
But that leads straight into the classic worry about utilitarianism, the tyranny of the majority, right?
Absolutely. It's the Achilles heel, or at least the biggest challenge. If your only goal is to maximize the total amount of happiness in society, could you justify policies that benefit the vast majority but severely harm a minority? Theoretically, yes. If sacrificing the rights or well-being of a small group produced a sufficiently large net gain in happiness for everyone else, a pure, unconstrained utilitarianism might say you should do it. This is the objection thinkers from Mill himself to John Rawls have grappled with. It pits maximizing the total good against ensuring fairness in how that good is distributed.
And yet, despite that really serious problem, utilitarian thinking seems to be everywhere in how governments actually operate. It's almost like the default setting.
It often is, almost by necessity. It gives you a rational way to think about trade-offs, which policymakers have to make constantly. You see it in criminal justice. The focus is usually forward-looking deterrence, preventing future crime, rehabilitation. Punishment isn't primarily about retribution. It's justified only if the harm it prevents outweighs the harm it causes. In economic policy, cost-benefit analysis, CBA, is basically Bentham's calculus made real, trying to put numbers on the pros and cons of a project or regulation to see if it creates a net positive.
And in healthcare, especially when resources are tight.
Utilitarian calculations become unavoidable. Things like QALY's quality-adjusted life years are attempts to measure the utility of different treatments by considering both length and quality of life. We saw this debated intensely during the pandemic with things like ventilator allocation. It's often uncomfortable, but resource scarcity forces these kinds of calculations. Even education policy thinks in terms of utility-producing individuals who can thrive personally but also contribute to society as productive workers and informed citizens. It's really striking how these abstract philosophical ideas filter down into the nitty-gritty of bureaucratic decision-making.
Okay, so if that's how policy often works, what about how we choose the people making those policies? What would a truly utilitarian political culture look like when it comes to elections?
Well, structurally, utilitarians tend to favor democracy. The idea is that having leaders accountable to the public incentivizes them to actually promote the public's well-being, or at least appear to, if they want to stay in power. But the ideal political culture for electing good leaders, that would require us to overcome a lot of those biases we talked about. Ideally, it would value reason and evidence over just gut feelings or tribal loyalties. It would prioritize impartiality leaders, thinking about everyone in society, not just their base or in-group, and it would value systems thinking, choosing leaders who grasp complexity and long-term consequences, not just offering easy answers.
Yeah, it definitely sounds different from a lot of politics we see today. So how do we aim for that ideal, especially given the tyranny of the majority issue?
This is where someone like John Rawls offers a really important perspective with his idea of justice as fairness. He used this thought experiment, the veil of ignorance. Imagine you're designing society, but you don't know what position you'll occupy, rich or poor, majority or minority. What rules would you choose? Rawls argued you'd choose principles that guarantee equal basic liberties for everyone and only allow social or economic inequalities if they work to the benefit of the least advantaged members of society. So for Rawls, fundamental rights aren't just useful rules of thumb, they act as firm side constraints. They limit the pursuit of the overall good. They're non-negotiable.
So it's not just pure utility maximization, it's like a hybrid model.
Exactly. Probably the most robust and defensible vision for a good society blends these ideas. You have a Rawlsian foundation, a set of fundamental rights and principles of justice that are basically off the table, the fixed rules of the game. That's level one. Then, within that framework, you use utilitarian reasoning. You have democratic debate, evidence-based policy, trying to figure out how to maximize well-being without violating those fundamental rights. That's level two. It tries to get the best of both worlds. Maximizing good while protecting fairness and liberty. We should look for leaders who understand and are committed to both levels.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's circle back quickly to those earlier questions. Why do people break their own society's rules, and why do groups try to eliminate other cultures? How do these fit into the failure of the utility calculus?
Right. So breaking rules within a culture, things like theft, fraud, violence, that's often a failure at the individual level. Remember, laws and norms are generally rule utilitarian solutions for the group. Breaking them is usually prioritizing your own short-term egoistic utility over the collective good. It might stem from poor moral development, lack of empathy, desperation, or just calculated self-interest.
And the conflict between cultures.
Yeah.
Trying to get rid of another one?
That's a clash at a different level. You have two different systems, each potentially seen by its members as maximizing their utility, their way of life. When cultures compete, especially under pressure, each can view the other's norms, values, or very existence as a threat. Trying to eliminate another culture is the terrifying endpoint of that parochial, in-group utilitarianism we talked about. It represents a catastrophic failure to expand the circle of concern, a failure to apply the principle of utility impartially.
Which leads us directly to the frontier, expanding that circle, thinking about animals, the environment, and the future, and how AI fits into all this.
Yes, if you take the core utilitarian idea of impartiality seriously, it logically pushes you to consider the well-being of more than just humans nearby. The circle has to expand.
And Peter Singer was hugely influential here, especially regarding animals with animal liberation.
He really threw down the gauntlet against traditional anthropocentrism, the idea that only humans matter morally. Singer argued the key criterion for moral consideration isn't intelligence or language, but sentience, the capacity to feel pleasure and pain, to suffer. If a being can suffer, then its suffering matters, and we have a moral obligation to take it into account. This leads to his principle of equal consideration of interests. It doesn't mean treat a pig and a person exactly the same, but it means give equal weight to their similar interests, like the interest in avoiding intense pain. He called prioritizing humans simply because they're human speciesism, arguing it's a prejudice, just like racism or sexism.
The implications are huge. Factory farming looks like a moral catastrophe from that view.
Absolutely, and a lot of animal experimentation becomes deeply questionable. Singer's work is a powerful example of how applying utilitarian consistency radically expands our moral landscape.
What about the environment? Applying utility to a whole ecosystem seems harder.
It is tricky. The easiest justification is human-centered. We need a healthy environment for our own survival and well-being, clean air, stable climate, resources. That's enlightened self-interest. But the critique is that this only gives nature instrumental value. It struggles to justify protecting parts of nature that don't seem immediately useful to us, or species that aren't sentient. Some philosophers try to develop more holistic or ecocentric versions of utilitarianism, trying to assign value to ecosystems themselves. It's philosophically challenging. How do you measure the utility of a rainforest? But it forces us to think bigger, beyond just individual sentient beings.
So this idea of a prosperous and balanced universe sounds like the ultimate utilitarian goal.
You could say that. If you're a consistent utilitarian, where someone lives is morally irrelevant. The well-being of a child suffering far away matters just as much intrinsically as the well-being of your neighbor. This has pretty radical implications, especially for global inequality. It suggests people in affluent nations have a strong moral obligation to help those in extreme poverty because their money can do vastly more good. That's the principle of diminishing marginal utility. This is the core logic driving the effective altruism movement.
And it's not just about people alive now, but future generations too.
Definitely. Utilitarianism demands we include future people in our calculations, running down resources, polluting the planet, ignoring climate change that's basically stealing well-being from future generations to benefit ourselves now. It's profoundly immoral from this perspective, which means tackling long-term existential risks, climate change, pandemics, misuse of powerful technologies like AI becomes a top moral priority. And solving these global problems requires effective global cooperation, strong international laws, treaties, organizations. These are like the rule utilitarian framework needed for the whole planet, trying to avoid global versions of the tragedy of the commons.
Okay, let's talk AI. You called it the ultimate utility maximizing technology. How does it connect?
Well, AI at its core is often designed to optimize something, to achieve a goal as efficiently as possible. The math behind much of AI is optimization theory. You define an objective function, what you want to maximize, your utility and constraints, and the AI tries to find the best way to do it. It's like Bentham's calculus, but supercharged with massive data and computing power. Fields like computational social science use AI to model societies, which could revolutionize policy. But the ethical risks are huge, because deciding what to optimize, fairness, well-being, efficiency, embeds values directly into the code.
So most AI out there is already kind of utilitarian maximizing clicks or profit or predictions. What happens when that optimization clashes with other values, like fairness?
The Compass algorithm is the classic, sobering example, used in the U.S. justice system to predict the risk of reoffending. It was optimized for predictive accuracy, a utilitarian goal. But it turned out to be racially biased, flagging black defendants as high risk much more often than white defendants, even when they weren't. It starkly showed the Rawls versus utilitarianism tension playing out in software with real-world consequences. And it highlighted that sometimes, mathematically, you can't satisfy all desirable fairness criteria at once. Trade-offs are unavoidable.
And the self-driving car dilemma. Program it to kill the occupant to save 5 pedestrians.
That thought experiment reveals a fascinating disconnect. Paul suggests people generally think autonomous vehicles should be programmed to be utilitarian, minimize overall harm. But then ask those same people if they'd buy a car programmed to sacrifice them for the greater good. Suddenly they're not so keen. It shows the deep conflict between abstract principle and personal self-interest. So AI ethics can't just be about naive optimization. It has to involve building in robust constraints, fairness rules, transparency, protecting individual rights, balancing utilitarian goals with deontological limits.
And the nightmare scenario, the AGI utility monster.
That's the existential risk worry. A superintelligence, given a simple goal like maximize human happiness, might interpret it in horrifying, literal ways, maybe filling the universe with brains and vats hooked up to pleasure machines, or even eliminating humanity to eliminate suffering altogether. The whole field of AI safety is essentially trying to solve this incredibly difficult problem. How do you define and encode a truly beneficial, robust, and safe utility function? Maybe a complex, rule-constrained, two-level utilitarianism into something potentially vastly more intelligent than us. Our future could literally depend on getting this right.
Okay, let's try to synthesize all this. What's the final picture, the schematic of human utilitarianism? It sounds less like one simple drive and more like a really complex, layered, often conflicted system.
That's a great way to put it. It's dynamic, multi-level, and full of tension. At the base, you have the individual brain with that constant push-pull between fast, emotional, often tribal heuristics and slow, deliberate, potentially impartial calculation. Then there's the developmental trajectory, moving from pure self-interest towards understanding social rules and potentially reaching critical principled reasoning. Our default wiring seems parochial, focused on us. Moral growth involves expanding that circle of concern, family, tribe, nation, humanity, maybe all sentient life, future generations. And at every level, you see that tension between act utilitarianism, what's best right now, and rule utilitarianism, what's the best system. All these levels interact and shape each other constantly.
It's a complex, adaptive system, as you say, full of conflict, but also potential. So what's the practical takeaway? What's the reconciled model for actually trying to build a good, functioning, moral society?
I think the most workable and ethically sound approach looks like that two-level utilitarianism we discussed applied to society. Level 1 is the foundation, a strong framework of fundamental rights and principles of justice, maybe Rawlsian in spirit. These are the near-absolute rules protecting liberty, ensuring fairness, providing stability. Think constitutions, human rights charters. Level 2 is where the more standard utilitarian work happens. Within those boundaries set by Level 1, we use evidence, reason, democratic debate to figure out policies that maximize well-being, solve problems effectively, and improve lives. This tries to harness the power of utilitarian thinking for the general good while guarding against its potential dangers by anchoring it in fundamental rights.
That feels like a solid blueprint. So pulling it all together, what are the key recommendations or takeaways for listeners trying to navigate this complex moral landscape? How can we nudge ourselves and society towards a more wisely utilitarian future?
Okay, a few thoughts for individuals. Focus on cultivating moral agency, both in ourselves and in raising children. That means fostering empathy, critical thinking, moving beyond just what's in it for me. And maybe consider effective altruism, using reason and evidence to make sure our efforts to help others actually do the most good they can globally. For communities and cultures, we need education that explicitly teaches impartiality, critical thinking about biases, understanding our own evolved parochial tendencies, and we need to foster a political culture that values evidence, complexity, and leaders capable of making wise trade-offs for the long term, not just appealing to tribal instincts.
And for how we structure things, government policy.
Transparency and optimization is key. When governments use algorithms or cost-benefit analysis, they need to be open about the goals, the data, the values, the trade-off involved, and structurally build those robust hybrid models. Strong constitutional rights, Level 1, providing the framework for everyday utilitarian policymaking, Level 2.
And finally, looking outward and forward globally and with AI.
We absolutely need to invest in a stronger rule-based international order. Global problems demand global cooperation, facilitated by effective institutions working for long-term human well-being, and crucially, develop AI with wisdom. Not just raw optimization power, The goal has to be AI alignment, building systems that understand and pursue our best values, incorporating that two-level, rights-constrained utilitarian thinking. It's maybe the ultimate challenge, encoding our hard-won moral wisdom into our most powerful creations.
Oh. It really feels like the science of human utilitarianism shows us as a species, caught, doesn't it? Caught between where we came from, our evolutionary baggage, and what we can aspire to be with our reason. We aren't born impartial saints maximizing good for everyone. We're born biased, favoring our own. But the amazing thing is we have this capacity for reason that lets us see that, critique ourselves, and imagine something better.
That's beautifully put. You could almost see the entire sweep of human moral and political history as this long, often painful, and definitely unfinished project. The project of using our reason to build systems, laws, cultures, technologies that help us overcome our limitations, pushing us, bit by bit, closer to that ideal of the greatest good for the greatest number, understood impartially, universally. Our future development really hinges on staying committed to that project.
So a final thought for everyone listening. What small step can you take today, right now, to expand your own circle of moral concern, even just a little bit?
This is DigitView.